Buckle up, because this is the story of how one reckless idea turned my marriage into a storm of betrayal and regret. If you think trust is the foundation of a solid relationship, I thought so too. Until my wife, Emily, shattered that belief with one casual suggestion. It started on a Sunday morning, the kind that makes you think life is simple and steady. We were at the kitchen table, Emily sipping coffee while scrolling through her phone, and I was reading the news. Everything seemed normal until she put her mug down and said, "David, I've been thinking about something." That's how it always began. Her ideas. Emily had a knack for throwing curveballs into our otherwise routine lives. Sometimes they were harmless, like trying a new hobby or taking a spontaneous weekend trip. But this time, I could tell by the look in her eyes that whatever she was about to suggest wasn't going to be simple. "What's on your mind?" I asked cautiously. She leaned forward, a strange mix of excitement and nerves on her face. "What if we tried something different for a week?" "Different how?" I asked, already bracing myself. "What if we opened up our marriage?" she said, her voice light and almost teasing. I laughed, thinking she was joking. "Yeah, right. What are you really thinking?" But she wasn't laughing. Her expression stayed serious, and my smile faded. "Wait, you're not kidding?" "It's not a big deal," she said quickly, as if reading my mind. "Just a week. 7 days to explore and, grow." I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh and say it was a prank. But she didn't. "You're serious?" "David, think about it," she said, leaning forward. "We've been together for 8 years. Don't you ever wonder what it would be like to experience something new? It doesn't mean I don't love you. It's just an opportunity to learn about ourselves and each other." My stomach turned at the thought. "Emily, I don't know. That's a lot to ask," she sighed, her tone shifting to one of reassurance. "It's just 1 week. We set rules, total honesty. It's not about replacing what we have. It's about strengthening it. You trust me, don't you?" There it was. The word trust. She knew exactly how to phrase it to make me question myself. I didn't want to seem insecure or controlling, but the idea of Emily being with someone else, it felt wrong. I tried to reason with her. "Emily, this isn't something you can just jump into. What if it causes more harm than good?" She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. "David, I wouldn't suggest this if I didn't think we could handle it. I love you, and this will only make us stronger." Her confidence was disarming, but I still had doubts. I wanted to say no, but the thought of being the boring husband who couldn't handle a little risk stopped me. Against my better judgment, I nodded. "Okay," I said reluctantly. 1 week. But we stick to the rules. No secrets." Her face lit up with relief and excitement. "You won't regret this," she said, squeezing my hand. But as the week unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a harmless experiment. The first night set the tone. Emily spent hours getting ready, wearing a dress I hadn't seen in years and makeup that made her look stunning. I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy as she stood by the door, checking her reflection one last time. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just out with some friends," she said, grabbing her purse. "Who?" She rolled her eyes. "Does it matter, David? It's just 1 night." And with that, she was gone. I spent the evening alone, nursing a beer and flipping through channels, trying not to think about where she was or who she was with. But my mind wouldn't stop racing. By the 3rd night, the unease had settled into a dull ache. Emily had been out every night, coming home late and brushing off my questions. When I asked if she'd met anyone, her answers were vague and dismissive. "Emily, this isn't what I signed up for," I said as she got ready to leave again. She sighed, exasperated. "David, it's just a few more days. Can't you trust me to handle this?" "I'm trying," I said, "but it feels like you're shutting me out." "I'm not shutting you out," she said, her tone sharp. "You agreed to this, remember? Just let me see it through." I let her go, but the knot in my stomach only tightened. By the end of the week, I was desperate for it to be over. I told myself we could chalk it up to a bad idea and move on, but something about Emily's behavior made me doubt that. On Sunday evening, she came home and asked to talk. Her expression was different this time. Nervous, almost scared. "David," she said, sitting across from me, There's something I need to tell you. I felt the air leave the room. What is it? She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. I'm pregnant. My heart stopped. Pregnant? But we hadn't. It's not yours, she added quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I stared at her, trying to process the words. My wife, the woman I thought I knew, had just dropped a bombshell that would shatter everything we'd built. And this was only the beginning. The silence after Emily's announcement was deafening. My mind raced, trying to grasp what she had just said. Pregnant. Not mine. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me stranded in a void of disbelief. Say that again. I managed, my voice barely audible. Emily's eyes darted away, unable to meet mine. I'm pregnant, she repeated softly, and it's not yours. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Not mine, I said, leaning back in my chair. Then whose is it, Emily? Let me guess, one of your friends from this week? She flinched at my tone, tears welling in her eyes. David, I didn't plan this, she said, her voice trembling. It just happened. I didn't mean for things to go this far. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. You didn't mean for things to go this far? I repeated, my voice rising. You're telling me you went into this little experiment without thinking about the consequences? I thought I could handle it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Well, clearly you couldn't, I snapped, pacing the room. And now you want me to do what, Emily? Pretend this didn't happen? Raise someone else's child as my own? Her head shot up, her expression desperate. David, I love you, she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. This doesn't change that. We can raise this baby together. It doesn't have to mean the end for us. I stopped pacing and turned to face her. How can you even say that? I asked, incredulous. Do you realize what you're asking of me? You betrayed me, and now you want me to clean up your mess? Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The betrayal cut too deep. I never stopped loving you, she insisted. This was a mistake, but it doesn't have to define us. Her words felt hollow, like they were meant more to comfort herself than me. A mistake? I said bitterly. Emily, this wasn't a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill or leaving the stove on. This was a choice. Your choice. And now you want me to deal with the fallout. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed, but I stayed rooted where I was, my emotions a storm of anger, hurt, and disbelief. David, please, she said, her voice cracking. We've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away because of this. Throw it all away? I repeated, laughing bitterly. You did that the second you decided someone else mattered more than what we had. She stood suddenly, crossing the room to grab my hands. Her grip was tight, desperate. I'm begging you, David, she said. We can get through this. I need you. The baby needs you. I pulled my hands away, the weight of her words pressing down on me. That baby isn't mine, I said coldly, and neither is this mess you've created. Her sobs filled the room as I turned and walked toward the door. Where are you going? She called after me, her voice laced with panic. To think, I said flatly, grabbing my jacket. Something you should have done before all this. The night air was cold and sharp as I stepped outside. I got into my car, but I didn't start it. Instead, I sat there in the darkness, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. How had it come to this? 8 years of marriage reduced to ashes because of one reckless decision. I thought about the woman I married, the one who promised loyalty, love, and a shared life. Was she even the same person anymore? Or had I been blind to who she truly was all along? I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. Not yet. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, replaying the conversation in my head. Every word felt like a dagger, reopening the wound each time. By the time I returned home, the house was silent. Emily had gone to bed, or at least retreated to the bedroom. I didn't check. Instead, I grabbed a blanket and settled on the couch. Sleep was impossible, but I needed the distance. The next morning, Emily approached me cautiously as I stood in the kitchen, making coffee. She looked exhausted, her eyes red and puffy from crying. David, she began, her voice shaky. I held up a hand, cutting her off. Don't, I said, my tone firm. I've made up my mind. Her face crumpled. Please, don't say that, she whispered. I'm filing for divorce, I said bluntly. She gasped, stepping back as if I'd struck her. David, no, she said. You can't mean that. I do, I said, my voice steady. You made your choices, Emily. Now I'm making mine. For the first time, she had no response. She simply stood there, her shoulders slumped in defeat, as I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. As I drove to my lawyer's office, a strange sense of clarity settled over me. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the certainty that I was doing the right thing. Whatever the future held, it couldn't be worse than staying in a marriage built on lies. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The fallout from Emily's choices was far from over. The morning after I told Emily I was filing for divorce, reality hit like a ton of bricks. The weight of what I was walking away from, and what she had destroyed, felt suffocating. But I also felt something else, a faint glimmer of relief. Emily, on the other hand, wasn't letting go quietly. You're overreacting, David, she said, her voice sharp as we sat at opposite ends of the dining table. One mistake, and you're ready to throw away everything we've built? I stared at her, unable to believe she could say that with a straight face. One mistake? Emily, you broke the trust that held our marriage together. This wasn't just a bad decision. It was a deliberate choice. She threw her hands up in frustration. It was a stupid, impulsive decision. I was trying to find something, anything, to shake us out of the rut we were in. I scoffed. And this is how you decided to do it? By turning our marriage into an experiment and bringing someone else into the equation? Her expression hardened. You agreed to the open relationship, David. Don't act like you didn't know this could happen. I agreed because you wouldn't let it go, I shot back. You pushed me into it, and now you want to blame me for not stopping you? That's rich. The tension between us was palpable. She glared at me, her jaw set, but she didn't argue further. For once, she seemed to realize there was no talking her way out of this. By the end of the day, I had made it official. The papers were filed, and I began preparing for the next chapter of my life. A chapter without Emily. Telling my family was harder than I expected. My parents had always admired Emily, praising her for her ambition and charm. Breaking the news of her betrayal felt like admitting I had failed in some way. My mom was quiet as I recounted what had happened, her lips pressed into a thin line. My dad, on the other hand, was livid. She had the audacity to ask you to raise that child, he said, his voice rising with each word. Unbelievable. I nodded. She thinks we can just move past it, like it's no big deal. She's delusional, my mom finally said, her tone icy. David, you're doing the right thing. Don't let her guilt you into staying. I appreciated their support, but it didn't make the situation any less painful. Emily and I had shared nearly a decade together, and now it felt like all of it was being erased. While I was dealing with the legal side of things, Emily was plotting her next move. A few days after I filed for divorce, she showed up at my office unannounced. Her face was pale, and her usual composure was noticeably absent. David, she began, her voice trembling. We need to talk. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. About what? About us, she said. About what happens next. There is no us, Emily, I said flatly. That's what happens next. Her eyes glistened with tears, but I didn't let it sway me. I had spent enough time feeling guilty for something I didn't do. David, please, she said. I know I messed up, but we've been through so much together. Don't you think we owe it to ourselves to try and fix this? Fix what? I asked, my voice rising. The trust you destroyed? The marriage you turned into a joke? You made your bed, Emily. Now you have to lie in it. She flinched, but she didn't back down. I can't do this alone, she said desperately. I thought I could, but I can't. I need you. Her words sparked something inside me, not sympathy, but anger. No, Emily, I said firmly. You don't need me. You need someone to save you from the mess you created. And I'm not going to be that person. Her tears flowed freely now, but I stood my ground. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly in control of my life. Later that evening, I got a call from a mutual friend. Apparently, Emily had gone to see Liam, the father of her child, and things hadn't gone as she planned. David, you're not going to believe this, the friend said. Emily went to Liam's place, begging him to step up, and he completely shut her down. Told her he wasn't interested in being part of her life or the baby's. I laughed bitterly. Of course he did. What did she expect? The friend hesitated. There's more. He's been seeing someone else this whole time. Hearing that was like adding salt to the wound. Emily had thrown away everything we had for a man who couldn't care less about her. When Emily returned home that night, her face was a mixture of anger and devastation. Don't say it, she snapped as she walked past me. Say what? I asked, feigning innocence. That you told me so, she said bitterly. I shrugged. I don't need to say it, Emily. You're living it. For the first time, she had no retort. She simply went upstairs, leaving me alone in the quiet house. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. I was finally free from the web of lies and betrayal she had spun. Or so I thought. The fallout was far from over. The house was eerily quiet when Emily returned that evening. She'd been gone all day, and by the look on her face, it hadn't gone the way she hoped. She dropped her bag on the counter, her expression a mixture of anger and humiliation. Don't, she said sharply before I could even speak. Don't what? I asked, feigning innocence. You know what, she snapped, her voice trembling. I don't want to hear it. Fine, I said, leaning back in my chair. I won't say a word. But I'm guessing Liam made himself clear. Her face darkened, and she turned away, pretending to fuss with her purse. But her silence was confirmation enough. Liam, the man she had thrown our marriage away for, had rejected her. I thought he cared, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't help but scoff. Cared? Emily, Liam only cares about Liam. You were convenient, and now that things are real, he's bailing. Did you honestly think he'd be different? Shut up, she hissed, turning on me. You don't know anything about him. I know enough, I said calmly. He's gone, Emily. Just like that fantasy you had about running off together. It's over. Her fists clenched, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. Instead, she stormed upstairs, slamming the door behind her. Over the next few days, Emily's spiral became impossible to ignore. She spent hours pacing the living room, phone in hand, leaving voicemail after voicemail for Liam. Each unanswered call seemed to chip away at the carefully composed exterior she'd always worn. He's ignoring me, she fumed one night, her voice trembling with frustration. He won't answer my calls, my texts, nothing. Shocking, I said dryly, flipping through the TV channels. It's almost like he doesn't want to deal with this. Her glare could have melted steel, but she didn't respond. Then, one night, she decided to shift her focus. If you don't help me with this baby, she said, her voice cold and calculated, I'll take you to court. I'll tell them you're the father, and you'll have no choice but to support us. Her words froze me in place. Slowly, I turned to face her, meeting her defiant gaze. You'd really go that far? If I have to, she said. I leaned forward, my tone steady but sharp. Emily, you can try. But before you do, think very carefully about what happens when the truth comes out. Because I guarantee it will. For the first time in weeks, I saw hesitation in her eyes. She knew I wasn't bluffing. The next morning, I called the clinic and scheduled a DNA test. I didn't believe for a second that the child was mine, but I needed hard proof to protect myself from whatever desperate move Emily might try next. I kept my plans to myself, determined to stay one step ahead. Emily's breakdown continued in the background as I waited for the test date. Each time I saw her pacing, shouting into her phone, or throwing it in frustration, I felt a strange mix of pity and detachment. The woman I had once loved was now a stranger, unraveling before my eyes. But no matter how chaotic things got, one thing was clear. Once those DNA results came back, the truth would be undeniable. And the fallout? That would be all hers to deal with. The days leading up to the DNA results felt like walking through quicksand. Emily's usual frantic pacing and calls to Liam had subsided, but her cold silence was no comfort. It was the kind of quiet that let you know the storm wasn't over. It was simply gathering strength. I kept my plans to myself. The DNA test had been a private move, something I needed to do not just to protect myself legally, but to bring clarity to the chaos Emily had thrown into my life. She had spent the past weeks trying to keep me tethered to her mess, and I wasn't about to let her drag me down further. The envelope arrived a week later, plain and unassuming, as if it didn't contain the answer to the question that had consumed me. I sat at the kitchen table, holding it in my hands, unable to open it right away. The possibility of the baby being mine loomed in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Finally, I tore it open, the paper inside trembling slightly in my grasp. My eyes darted down the page until I found the words I needed. Paternity result, 99.9% exclusion. I wasn't the father. Relief flooded through me, overwhelming and immediate. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, as though I had been freed from invisible chains I didn't realize had bound me so tightly. But just as quickly, the relief was replaced by anger. Emily had lied, manipulated, and threatened me, trying to force me into a role I never agreed to, all for a child that wasn't mine. She had gambled with our marriage, and now the truth was staring her in the face, whether she was ready for it or not. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the DNA results folded neatly in front of me. The document felt heavier than it should, a symbol of everything Emily had tried to hide. When she walked into the room, her expression was guarded, as though she knew something was coming. "What's that?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. I held the paper up, then slid it across the table toward her. "It's the truth," I said evenly. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she picked up the paper. Her eyes scanned the words, her face shifting from confusion to shock, and finally, to anger. "You went behind my back," she said, her voice rising. "I did what I had to do," I replied, my tone calm but firm. "I needed proof, Emily, and now I have it. That baby isn't mine." Her face flushed with indignation. "You didn't trust me enough to wait?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Trust? That's rich coming from you. You lied to me, betrayed me, and then tried to force me to raise another man's child. Trust went out the window the moment you decided our marriage wasn't enough for you." Her mouth opened, as if to argue, but no words came out. Instead, she crumpled the paper in her hand and threw it onto the table. "You didn't have to do this," she muttered. "Yes, I did," I said, standing. "Because I'm not going to let you drag me into something that was never mine to begin with." Over the next few days, Emily oscillated between anger and desperation. Some days, she accused me of being heartless, claiming I was abandoning her when she needed me most. Other days, she pleaded with me to reconsider, insisting that we could still rebuild what was left of our marriage. "We don't need Liam," she said one evening, her voice trembling. "We can raise this baby together. We can get past everything, just the two of us." I shook my head, my patience worn thin. "There's no we, Emily. Not anymore. You destroyed that." Her tears came in waves, but they no longer moved me. The woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. One night, she tried a different approach. "You don't understand how hard this is for me," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm scared, David. I don't know what to do." I looked at her, my expression neutral. "You should have thought about that before making the choices you did." Her sobs filled the room, but I didn't offer her comfort. I couldn't. Too much had been broken, and no amount of tears could undo the damage. As the days passed, Emily grew more withdrawn. The phone calls stopped, and the fiery determination that had defined her for so long seemed to extinguish. She spent most of her time in her room, leaving me to wonder what was going through her mind. Part of me felt pity for her, but I pushed it aside. This was the life she had chosen, and she had to live with the consequences. Meanwhile, I began to feel a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. The divorce was moving forward. The DNA test had cleared me of any responsibility for the child, and I was finally beginning to see a future without Emily's chaos hanging over me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Emily wasn't the type to go down quietly, and her silence felt more like a calm before the next storm. I didn't know what she was planning, but one thing was certain. I would be ready for whatever came next. Emily's silence lasted for a few days after I confronted her with the DNA results. At first, I thought she was finally processing everything, accepting that this was the end of our marriage. But deep down, I knew better. Emily wasn't the kind of person to let things go without a fight, and the quiet was just her way of regrouping. When the storm came, it hit harder than I expected. One evening, Emily cornered me in the kitchen. Her usual bitterness was gone, replaced by a cold, calculated determination that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "We need to talk," she said, crossing her arms. "I'm not sure what's left to say," I replied, sipping my coffee. "Oh, there's plenty to say," she shot back. "Like how you think you can just walk away from this and leave me to deal with everything on my own." I sighed, setting my cup down. "Emily, I didn't create this situation. You did. And now, you're trying to make it my responsibility." Her eyes narrowed. "If you won't help me willingly, David, I'll have to force you." I leaned back, my expression unchanging. "Force me? How exactly do you plan to do that?" Her voice dropped, her tone icy. "I'll take you to court. I'll tell them you're the father. I'll make sure you're on the hook for child support, whether you like it or not." For a moment, her words hung in the air, and I felt a flash of anger rise in my chest. Slowly, I stood, meeting her glare with one of my own. "You'd really go that far?" I asked. "If I have to," she replied, not blinking. "Go ahead," I said, my voice steady. "But let me tell you how that's going to play out. You can drag me into court, but when the DNA test results are presented, it's going to be crystal clear that I'm not the father. And once the judge sees you've lied to the court, things aren't going to go well for you." Her confidence wavered for a split second before she recovered. "You're underestimating how messy this can get, David. Even with that test, I can make your life miserable." "Do what you need to do," I said coldly. "But don't think for a second that I won't fight back. You've already lost Liam, and now you're trying to drag me down with you. It won't work." Emily's face flushed red with anger, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. Instead, she spun on her heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. That night, as I sat in the quiet living room, I replayed the conversation in my mind. Emily's desperation was reaching dangerous levels, and I knew I needed to be prepared for whatever move she tried next. The following morning, I called my lawyer to update him on the situation. He reassured me that the DNA results would hold up in court and that Emily's threats were empty. Still, the idea of her dragging me through a public battle wasn't something I wanted to deal with. "She's grasping at straws," my lawyer said. "She knows she's out of options. Just stay calm, and we'll handle this if it comes to that." I hung up the phone, feeling slightly more at ease, but the tension lingered. Over the next few days, Emily's behavior grew more erratic. She alternated between icy silence and sudden outbursts, as though she couldn't decide whether to hate me or beg me to stay. One afternoon, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. She didn't look up as I walked past, but her voice stopped me in my tracks. "I don't know what to do," she said, her tone devoid of the usual fire. I hesitated, torn between pity and the urge to leave her to figure it out on her own. Finally, I turned to face her. "That's something you'll have to figure out, Emily," I said quietly. "You made these choices, not me." Her head snapped up, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and despair. "Do you think I wanted this to happen? That I planned for things to fall apart like this?" "Maybe not," I replied. "But you knew the risks when you made the decisions you did. You wanted freedom, and now you have it. This is what it looks like." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she stood and walked out of the room. That night, I overheard her on the phone. She was talking to someone in hushed tones, her voice shaky and urgent. "I don't know what else to do," she said. "He won't help me, and Liam's completely disappeared. I'm out of options." There was a pause as the person on the other end replied, but I couldn't make out the words. I can't do this alone, Emily said, her voice breaking. I thought I could, but I can't. Hearing her like that should have moved me, but instead, it felt like a confirmation of everything I already knew. Emily had spent years pushing people away, and now, when she needed someone the most, there was no one left to lean on. The days that followed were quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different. Emily spent most of her time in her room, only emerging for brief moments before retreating again. Meanwhile, I focused on moving forward. I met with my lawyer to finalize the next steps for the divorce, and I started looking into new places to live. For the first time in months, I felt like I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. The chaos Emily had brought into my life was slowly fading, and with each passing day, I felt more certain that I had made the right decision. But I also knew Emily well enough to realize that her silence didn't mean she had given up. If anything, it meant she was planning something else. And whatever it was, I'd be ready for it. For a while, it seemed like Emily had finally accepted her situation. The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so, and she spent most of her time holed up in the bedroom or on her phone. I thought maybe she was preparing to move on, figuring out her next steps, but Emily's silence wasn't surrender. It was the calm before the storm, and I didn't realize how close that storm was until it was right in front of me. One evening, as I was sitting on the couch going through some paperwork, Emily walked into the living room. Her posture was tense, her expression unreadable, but there was a spark of something behind her eyes that made me wary. "We need to talk," she said, standing in the doorway. I glanced up, but didn't put down the papers. "What now, Emily?" She stepped closer, arms crossed. "I want us to try again." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she said, her voice firm. "I know things have been bad, really bad. But we've been through tough times before, and I think we can get through this too." I set the papers aside and leaned back in my seat, studying her carefully. "Emily, do you really believe that? Or is this just another way to avoid facing reality?" Her jaw tightened. "You don't think I'm serious?" "No, I don't," I said bluntly. "Because if you were serious about saving this marriage, you wouldn't have done half the things you did." She flinched at my words, but recovered quickly. "People make mistakes, David. We're human. And I know I've hurt you, but I also know that I still love you. I believe we can fix this, if you're willing to try." I shook my head slowly. "Emily, I've already made my decision. I'm moving forward with the divorce. There's nothing left to fix." Her eyes narrowed, and the calm facade she'd been wearing cracked. "So that's it," she said, her voice rising. "You're just walking away? After everything we've been through, you're going to throw it all away?" "You threw it away, Emily," I replied, my voice steady. "The moment you betrayed me, the moment you lied to me, and the moment you tried to manipulate me into raising a child that isn't mine. You made this choice, not me." Her face turned red with anger, and for a moment, she looked like she might explode. Instead, she stormed across the room and grabbed the stack of divorce papers I had been working on. "You think this is going to fix everything?" she snapped, waving the papers in the air. "You think you can just sign a piece of paper and make me disappear?" "It's not about making you disappear," I said calmly. "It's about moving on. Something you clearly need to do too." She threw the papers onto the coffee table and pointed a trembling finger at me. "You'll regret this, David," she hissed. "I promise you, you'll regret this." The next few days were tense, to say the least. Emily barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was short and clipped. I went about my routine, refusing to engage with her anger or her attempts to provoke me. Then, one morning, I woke up to find her standing in the kitchen with her phone in hand. She looked almost smug, like she had just won a fight I didn't know we were having. "What's with the look?" I asked, grabbing a mug for coffee. "I've been talking to a lawyer," she said, her tone dripping with defiance. I didn't even flinch. "Good for you. I hope they gave you some good advice." She smirked. "Oh, they did. And they told me that I have rights, David. Rights you're going to have to respect." I took a slow sip of coffee, refusing to let her get under my skin. "Emily, do whatever you feel you need to do. Just don't expect me to be intimidated by your threats." Her expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "You think you're so untouchable," she said, her voice low. But you'll see, David. You'll see. Later that day, I called my lawyer to give him a heads up about Emily's latest antics. She's bluffing, he said confidently. She doesn't have a leg to stand on, especially with the DNA results in hand. Just stay the course, and we'll get through this. His reassurance helped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was up to something more. That night, she tried a different approach. She came into the living room while I was watching TV, her demeanor softer than it had been in weeks. David, she began, her voice quiet. I know I've made things difficult for you, and I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly. I turned off the TV and looked at her, trying to gauge whether she was being sincere or just playing another angle. I appreciate the apology, I said after a moment, but it doesn't change anything. The damage is done, Emily. There's no going back. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked genuinely defeated. I just don't want to lose everything, she said softly. You already lost me, I replied, my voice firm but not unkind. Now it's time to figure out what comes next for you. Emily retreated to her room after that, and for the next few days, she kept to herself. I thought maybe she was finally starting to come to terms with the situation. But then, one evening, I found a letter sitting on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to me in Emily's handwriting, and when I opened it, I felt my stomach drop. In the letter, Emily laid out everything. Her regrets, her anger, and her desperation. But what stood out most was the final line. I've decided I need to make a choice for myself, one that I've been putting off for too long. By the time you read this, I'll already be gone. I stared at the letter, a mix of confusion and dread filling my chest. Emily wasn't the type to make dramatic exits without a plan, and I couldn't shake the feeling that her choice wasn't what it seemed. She had left, but this wasn't the end. I was sure of it, and whatever came next, I would be ready for it. Emily's absence brought a strange mix of relief and unease. The house was quieter without her constant arguments and schemes, but her letter and sudden departure left me with a lingering sense of dread. She wasn't the type to leave loose ends, and her cryptic note hinted that she still had something unfinished. A few days later, I got a call from Laura, one of our mutual friends. David, I ran into Emily today, Laura said cautiously. She seemed different. She said she was working on a clean slate and figuring things out. I'm not sure she's in a good place. Did she say where she's staying? I asked. No, but she mentioned leaving town soon, Laura replied. I thanked her for letting me know, but the call only deepened my unease. Emily's talk of a clean slate sounded more like someone grasping for control in the middle of a downward spiral. The next evening, I decided to reach out to Megan, another close friend of Emily's. Megan, have you heard from her? I asked after explaining the situation. She texted me a few days ago, Megan said. She mentioned unfinished business, but wouldn't explain what that meant. I tried to press her, but she didn't respond. The phrase, unfinished business, stuck with me. Emily's words in the letter, combined with these cryptic messages, made it clear she wasn't done trying to make things right, or at least, her version of right. Days turned into a week with no sign of Emily. I threw myself into finalizing the divorce and looking for a new place, but her shadow loomed over everything. Then, late one night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Emily, we need to talk. Meet me tomorrow at the park at 2 p.m. Don't ignore this. For a moment, I considered not replying. After everything, I didn't owe her anything. But something in the message felt urgent, and ignoring it might lead to more chaos. Finally, I replied, fine. When I arrived at the park, Emily was already there, sitting on a bench near the fountain. She looked different, tired, defeated, like the weight of the past few weeks had finally caught up to her. I'm glad you came, she said as I approached. What's this about? I asked, crossing my arms. She held out a folder. These are the baby's medical records and appointment details, she said. I thought you should have them. I frowned, taking the folder reluctantly. Why would I need these? The DNA test already proved the baby isn't mine. I just thought you might want to know, she said quietly, even if you don't want to be involved. Her words caught me off guard, but I quickly realized what she was trying to do. This wasn't just about information. It was another attempt to pull me back in. Emily, I've made my decision, I said firmly. I'm not the father, and I'm not going to pretend I am. Tears filled her eyes, and she looked away. I just wanted to believe there was still hope, she said. I softened slightly but stayed firm. You need to let this go. Focus on yourself and what's ahead. She nodded, wiping her face. I know. I just needed to hear it from you. That night, as I went through the folder, I found a small handwritten note tucked inside. David, I know I've made mistakes, too many to count, but I want you to know that I truly did love you. I hope one day you can forgive me. Emily. I folded the note and set it aside, unsure how to feel. Forgiveness felt far away, but for the first time, I felt like I was closing a chapter. Emily's choices had brought us to this point, and now it was time for me to move on. But even as I resolved to leave the past behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's story wasn't finished yet. Emily's attempt to reconcile had been her last effort to pull me back into her life, but it only reinforced my decision to move forward. The divorce papers were nearly finalized, and I was preparing for a fresh start. Still, the uneasy feeling that her chapter wasn't over lingered in the back of my mind. Then, one afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Megan. Megan, I just saw Emily. She looked really upset. She mentioned something about making a big decision soon. Have you talked to her? I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. We talked briefly a few days ago, but nothing recent. Did she say what decision she was talking about? Megan, no, but it seemed serious. I'm worried about her. I sighed, feeling the familiar weight of concern settle over me. Despite everything, I couldn't completely turn off the part of me that cared. That evening, I received another text, this time from Emily. Emily, thank you for meeting me the other day. I've made my decision now, and I just wanted you to know I'm moving forward. I hope someday you'll understand. Her message was vague, but it carried an air of finality. I replied, asking her to clarify, but she didn't respond. The next day, I decided to reach out to Laura, who had also been in touch with Emily recently. She's been talking about starting over, Laura said. She mentioned that she couldn't move forward without letting go of everything weighing her down. I tried asking what she meant, but she changed the subject. Did she seem okay to you? I asked. Not really, Laura admitted. She seemed empty, like she'd given up on trying to fix anything. I'm not sure what she's planning, but I don't think it's healthy. Her words only deepened my concern. Emily's behavior had been unpredictable, but this felt different. It was as if she was preparing to make a decision she couldn't come back from. 2 days later, I got a call from an unknown number. When I picked up, a woman's voice greeted me. Is this David? Yes, I said cautiously. Who's this? This is Jennifer from Lakeside Women's Clinic. I'm calling because Emily Robinson listed you as her emergency contact. My stomach sank. What happened? Is she okay? She's fine, Jennifer assured me. She came in today for a procedure, and she asked us to notify you once it was completed. She said you'd understand. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I didn't need her to elaborate. I knew exactly what procedure Emily had undergone. Thank you for letting me know, I said, my voice tight. As I hung up, a mix of emotions washed over me. Relief, sadness, and a strange sense of closure all tangled together. Emily had made her choice. A choice I knew must have been devastating for her, even if it was necessary. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. Emily's decisions, her mistakes, her struggles. It all felt like a whirlwind that had finally come to a stop. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lifting. Emily had made her final decision, and now it was my turn to move forward. The chaos was over, and the future, uncertain but mine to shape, lay ahead. In the weeks following Emily's final decision, life began to settle into a strange kind of normalcy. The divorce papers were signed, the house was sold, and I moved into a modest apartment closer to the city. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity, like I was finally stepping out of a fog. I threw myself into work, reconnected with old friends, and even started exploring hobbies I'd put on hold for too long. The chaos Emily had brought into my life was finally fading, leaving room for something new. But just as I thought the chapter was closed, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, I received a small package in the mail with no return address. Curious, I opened it to find a single envelope and a folded piece of paper. The envelope contained a handwritten letter from Emily. David, by the time you read this, I'll already be on my way to start over somewhere new. I realized that staying here was only keeping me stuck in the past. I needed to leave, not just for myself, but to give us both the chance to move on. You probably won't believe this, but I truly am sorry for everything. I never wanted to hurt you the way I did, and I'll regret my actions for the rest of my life. I've left you something I think you deserve to know. It's a truth I was too afraid to tell you before. Whatever you do with it is up to you, but I hope it brings you some closure. Take care. Emily, ****. I unfolded the paper that came with the letter. It was a detailed account of her relationship with Liam, when it began, how it unfolded, and the lies she had told to keep it hidden. But buried in the middle of the page was something that made my breath catch. Liam wasn't the only man she had been seeing during our marriage. The revelation hit me like a brick. For all her talk about connections and mistakes, Emily had been hiding even more than I realized. It wasn't just Liam. There had been someone else, someone I'd never even suspected. I sat back, staring at the letter in disbelief. Part of me wanted to crumple it up and throw it away, to let this final piece of the puzzle fade into obscurity. But another part of me, the part that had spent months questioning everything, wanted answers. In the end, I decided not to pursue it. Emily was gone, and whatever truth her letter held wouldn't change what had already happened. Digging deeper into her lies would only keep me tethered to a past I was determined to leave behind. I burned the letter that evening, watching the flames consume her words until nothing was left but ash. Moving forward wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I rebuilt my life piece by piece, focusing on the things that mattered: my career, my relationships, and my own happiness. Emily had been a chapter in my story, one filled with pain and betrayal, but also lessons I would carry with me. And as I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. The storm was over, and for the first time, the future felt like my own. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you were in the protagonist's shoes, how would you have handled the situation differently? If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel and give us a like.